So good morning and welcome to the 2023 Legislative Conference of the League of Women Voters of Colorado. I'm Irene Tynes, the president of the Colorado League, and I'm pleased to open this showcase. I'm sure you know that since 1920, the League has been empowering voters and defending democracy. And our legislative conference is an excellent illustration of both sides of this mission, education and advocacy. Today, a number of our legislatures and valued partners will offer you education on Colorado's support for aging population, what might happen to our state's finances with the double whammy of Proposition 121 and 123 passing, and current legislation to step up gun violence prevention and more. Of course, we'll include our own internal priorities and predictions for the 74th General Assembly of Colorado, which convened its first regular session last Monday. These topics represent some of the League's priorities for action. Issues on which we'll advocate for a better Colorado, one where all residents are treated fairly and equitably. And we'll be asking you too to advocate. So keep an eye on your inbox for action alerts and other opportunities to make your voice heard. Before we go any further though, we're honored to have with us today Yadira Solis, the host of El Seminario's We Speak Your Language podcast. Yadira will be providing Spanish interpretation of today's conference as part of an exciting partnership between LWVCO and El Seminario's dual language newspaper to increase language justice and equity in our state, while offering a nonpartisan voter education to El Seminario readers. Yadira, welcome and thank you. She will now offer instructions for accessing Spanish interpretation today. Yadira? Yadira, I see you, but you're on mute.
Okay. Sorry, for a second, I couldn't unmute myself at all.
Well, welcome. We're glad you're here.
Yeah, so first and foremost, I am honored to be interpreting for everyone here and offering Spanish services for those that do need Spanish services, and make it as inclusive as possible, because sometimes language access could be a barrier for simply being included in conversations. One of the things I wanted to ask is, did the hosts of the meeting create and enable interpretation when you started the Zoom?
Yes.
You did. Okay. So if you can select next to my name, you can say you can select the language. So if we're doing this in English, if somebody participates in Spanish and I'm interpreting into English, you can select your English language. For those that need this into Spanish, this will be available into the Spanish section. Does everybody see this globe at the bottom of their screens? No. I think at one moment I did see the English interpretation option.
I'll start the interpretation now, but that means we will not be able to hear Yadira until someone enters the interpretation.
Correct. So those that do need a Spanish interpretation of what is going on, I will be able to do that in that channel. And I don't know how many within this meeting have this availability or need this service.
So I will begin interpretation now. To access Yadira's interpretation, please click the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. Thank you again, Yadira.
You're very welcome. And once you go ahead and get started and you select Spanish, if you do need the Spanish interpretation, you will hear me in Spanish.
Irene.
Yes. Are we good?
Yes.
Okay, well then good. I think this is fairly simple. It's something new for us, so it's a little bit tricky, but I'm just thrilled that Yadira is here with us today, that our partnership with El Seminario's newspaper, et cetera, is just going to change the way we do business at the League of Women Voters of Colorado. So thank you again, Yadira. Your interpretation skills are deeply appreciated, and the League works to ensure that every Colorado may access LWVCO resources wherever they are. In times like these, our democracy is clearly more fragile than ever before. It is inspiring to see so many people care about the inner workings of our state and to give up their Saturday morning. I guess you know that the League of Women Voters is a cure for helplessness many of us are feeling in our nation's state of affairs. The League gives us a platform to act. The League gives us a platform to act and make changes as well as learn. So thank you for joining us and knowing that your voice is an invaluable part of democracy and that our democracy is worth fighting for. So I'm ready to get started. Are you ready to get started? I'm going to turn this over. Yes, I'm going to turn this over to Andrea Wilkins. Andrea is the LWVCO's staff legislative liaison. Andrea, thank you.
Thank you, Irene. First up today, we are very happy to welcome Senator Joanne Ginal and Jared Hughes, the Governor Polis's Senior Policy Advisor on Aging, who will be speaking to us today about Colorado's aging framework, providing a guide for policymakers, providers, and others for aging well in Colorado. We've got a lot of great information to come. We're happy to welcome our first two speakers. Let's kick things off with Senator Ginal, and then we will shift to Jared.
Good morning. This is Senator Ginal. Right now I am unable to speak, and I'm going to kick it over to Jared because I just am in a place where I cannot speak right now. So I'm sorry for that inability to do that at the moment. So please forgive me.
No, thanks, Senator. And thanks, Andrea and Irene, for having me today and having the governor's office represented. At a very high level, I don't think I could say enough about kind of our commitment to free and open elections. So I commend you all on your work and thank you for the opportunity. So I am going to share my screen here. So I'm going to walk through some slides that I've put together just around some of our general framework and initiatives, and then talk a little bit about our second term priorities. And then I will kind of, my MO here is to often put probably a bit more information than is completely necessary, but I think I won't spend too much time belaboring it, but I think it's great to get it out there and to have it all at your fingertips. So as Andrea noted, I am the governor's senior advisor on aging. And I think it's probably also worth noting that actually beginning next week, I'll be transitioning into a deputy policy director role within the governor's office, yet I will retain the primary focus kind of within my policy portfolio. And so, I have kind of arrived at this world and kind of focus on aging and later life, really kind of through a lot of my own family's experiences with caregiving. My mom was a primary caregiver for both of her parents who had dementia, my grandfather being an early onset diagnosis. And so spent a lot of time in long-term care and skilled nursing and memory care growing up. So when it came time for college, kind of ended up having some professors that were very demography heavy. And so demography is very much kind of the evidence base that we use to do this work. So I base really everything that I do kind of on that foundation of our shifting demographics. And, you know, there's a saying that demography is destiny. You know, I try not to be that prescriptive, but I do think that there are what we know, some fairly predictable systemic impacts associated with Colorado shifting demographics and the country's overall. So my work is really focused on leading policy development and agency implementation with that demographic lens applied. So my work is directly related to strategies that were laid out by the Strategic Action Plan on Aging. And so through the Strategic Action Planning Group on Aging is really actually where I was introduced to Andrea and was able to work with her and work with that group over the course of a few years. And now I'm in a position to help drive that work forward. I think maybe the only other caveat there is our current Lieutenant Governor, Diane Primavera, ran the bill to create the Strategic Action Planning Group on Aging back in 2015. And I'm unclear on how much you all tend to engage with the Lieutenant Governor, but I can't say enough good things about her and her focus kind of in this work and in healthcare in general. So I put a plug in for LG whenever I can. I think I have nothing but praise for her. So like I said, I base everything in demographics. So I won't spend too much time on this, but I think it's helpful to see. So our 65 plus population is the fastest growing age cohort we have in Colorado. And I think you see here that 75 to 84 demographic is the largest percentage growth. I also like to show here that not only do we have that percentage growth that's significant, but we also have that in real numbers. So I kind of refer to this as a demographic switch, if you will. So actually this year, our state demographer's office, which is housed within the Department of Local Affairs, projects that Coloradans age 60 plus will actually surpass Coloradans aged under 18. This has never happened before in the history of Colorado. Nationally, this happens about 2030, 2035, somewhere in that time frame. So we are ahead of the curve with regards to kind of our population aging. The Department of Local Affairs only projects out to 2050, but you see this discrepancy and this gap grow. So what that means is that this is our new normal as we move forward. So obviously we have kind of this first wave, if you will, of baby boomers, but you know, my generation, the millennials, are almost just as large as the baby boomer population. So we have this kind of two-wave scenario where this is not kind of a one-time deal. And I think that's really important to be clear about as we move forward kind of in our policy planning and implementation. So at a very high level, you know, my background is in gerontology. That's where my master's degree is in. I'm fortunate enough to also be on faculty at Colorado Mesa University, where I'm able to teach some gerontology courses and help with their program advisory board. But aging doesn't occur in a vacuum. I think historically, we've often talked about it as 50 plus, 60 plus, 65 plus, but most of that's really tied to Medicare, Social Security, kind of some arbitrary numbers age that we have put on benefits. But the reality is that we take a lifespan approach, kind of lifespan lens to health and aging. So it really is kind of a cumulative experience across the life course that impacts outcomes in later life. So you think about social and environmental factors, nutrition, access to housing, access to healthcare, education, workforce, all of these things impact our lives and our human development. You know, I often say that it's our experiences in our 20s and 30s and 40s that really impact our 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. So I like to paint that kind of brush or that broad brush stroke for folks to really kind of be clear that this isn't something aging older adults. It isn't something that we should only be talking about with regards to kind of a age cohort specific approach, but something that I feel very strongly that 20, 30, 40-year-olds should really be engaged in these conversations. I think over the years, I have been very fortunate enough in this work to have a lot of wonderful mentors who are 20, 30, 40 years older than myself. And I think that's really important to understand the work, but also to just help learn and collect that experience and move forward with it So I talked about the systemic impacts. This is a pretty broad brushstroke as well, but these are kind of the issue areas that were all called out through the work of the Strategic Action Planning Group on Aging. So this is expansive, right? Our Office of State Planning and Budgeting used to have a quote in the governor's budget request that said, our aging population impacts every department in the state, whether that be Department of Transportation or Natural Resources. So demography really does have that far-reaching impact kind of on our policy and the ways that we should address kind of community investments. So I put this together kind of specifically for this presentation. I think I remember in some of my gerontology education, I had a professor that would often say that the issues of aging are the issues of women as well. I think when we think about our caregiving workforce, our formal workforce, nearly 90% of them are women. You think about our family caregivers, nearly 70% tend to be women. Accordingly, women are more likely to leave the workforce to provide unpaid care, and women are more likely to be the ones to provide care and also have a longer life expectancy. So all of this is to say that I think not only given kind of our demographic reality, but as you all are kind of going through your work and thinking about issue areas that maybe tap into or kind of grow into, I think that this is an area that's very much ripe for engagement. And I think that we are only moving towards this becoming, I think, a kind of larger issue down at the state capitol and then also at the national level. So wanted to put this information here, but there's a lot of great academic research out there, as well as some more accessible information if you want to do some more digging around. And I think also I'll just put a plug out there. If anyone here wants to reach out to me afterwards, Andrea, please feel free to make a connection. So I've kind of laid out a pretty broad picture here. We talk about all of these different issues kind of under the umbrella of Lifelong Colorado. So Lifelong Colorado is really our initiative that connects local, regional, and state strategies to support older Coloradans, their families, and our communities. I think acknowledging the fact that, aging policy, if you will, is healthcare workforce development, as well as local transit planning, accessibility accommodations and housing, affordable housing, nutrition support services, medical care, all of these things, they all have to live in different places. I think we have this big puzzle, if you will, and all the pieces have to align. And I think under Lifelong Colorado is where that puzzle kind of lives. So this visual here, I think, kind of tries to capture that. So, there's work that's going on at the Department of Labor and Employment, the Department of Human Services, the Department of Public Health. All of that lives underneath Lifelong Colorado. And all of that's related to local and regional strategies that we are working with our local government partners on, our nonprofit sector partners, and the private sector as well. So this is by no means comprehensive. There is more going on across the state than I could even really spend my time with you today talking about. But I think it's nice to help visualize that. But I think perhaps kind of one of the takeaways here, I think, would be Lifelong Colorado is really our initiative out of the governor's office to help drive forward these strategies. So I think that's kind of the talking point, the brand, if you will, that we try to use. So I'm going to talk a little bit about second-term priorities, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about our current legislative session. So I think the governor and lieutenant governor's focus, I think one of their primary issue areas has always been saving people money on healthcare. The lieutenant governor leads up that work out of her office, and I think we have focused very much so on prescription drug costs in the first 4 years of the administration, and that will continue to be a focus as we move forward. One of the things that I have been working very closely on and will continue to do so during the legislative session is on skilled nursing care reform. So I think obviously I don't need to kind of elaborate the impacts of the pandemic on the long-term care industry. I think not only do we have kind of the obviously the immediate impacts of the pandemic, but we have these lingering effects on healthcare workforce and kind of staffing dynamics that have created a very really treacherous kind of market environment for that industry. And so we are at a point where we need to kind of rebase our kind of funding formulas and really kind of strive towards driving the outcomes we want to see with our reimbursement methodology. So, reimbursement methodologies are by no means the most exciting thing in the world, but they're critical and very important to what we do. Really quickly, I think one of the other things that is a top priority and kind of top of mind for myself is better addressing complex behavioral health and medical needs. So if we hadn't been dealing with the pandemic for the last, 3 years or so, this would be kind of one of the primary focuses within assisted living as well as skilled nursing, because I think whether or not we're talking about individuals with schizophrenia who also have pulmonary disease, talking about that intersection between medical needs and behavioral health. And the reality is we don't have a setting that particularly works well for anyone in that subgroup. So this is something that we're driving towards as well. I mentioned healthcare workforce development. That will continue to be a focus in the second term. This is something that really bubbled up over the last year and a half, primarily tied to the impacts of the pandemic. So our direct care workers, which tend to be women and tend to be women of color, I will say, have been very much a priority for us and top of mind in my work as well. One of the things we are really excited about is moving towards implementation of our paid family and medical leave. So again, hearkening back to that slide around family caregivers, primarily being women, women often leave the workforce in order to provide that unpaid care, and family will be an option to help those folks receive some income so that labor is not entirely unpaid, if you will. And then they'll be able to come back and move back into their job. I think additionally, affordable housing is going to be a top priority. I think on my next slide, I have some state of the state takeaways, and I think the governor spent about 30 minutes talking about housing on Tuesday, at State of the State. So reducing barriers to overall housing development, increasing supply, and expanding the supply of affordable and middle income housing is really critical to making sure that all Coloradans kind of have the opportunity to live and work in a place that they can afford. I think we don't have to go very far to kind of talk to folks, teachers, nurses, CNAs that already have to live outside of the city because we simply can't afford to buy homes within Denver any longer. So this is something that I think we very much feel like if we don't tackle head on in our next 4 years, then it's going to be the biggest issue on the next governor's plate, and it's going to be even more complicated to problem solve. So this economic and workforce development piece is somewhat complicated, so I don't want to get in the weeds too much here, but I think kind of the primary takeaway here is as our demographic shifts, our workforce becomes older. And there's nothing, I think the piece there that is really kind of that we need to drive home to kind of our industry partners is that we simply don't have the same number of traditional kind of hires, if you will. So you think about folks coming out of college, you think about that pipeline of 18 to 25-year-olds. It's simply not there the way it used to be. So thinking about intentional and strategic recruitment and workforce accommodations for adults in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. This is going to be something that we have to think about if we're going to have an economy that works for everyone. So I mentioned state of the state. I won't belabor this. I think you all can take a look here, but I think the housing focus, better addressing social determinants of health, property tax relief, prescription drug costs, the education system that works for all ages, and healthcare workforce development really kind of bubble up the top for me and are kind of key areas that I'll continue to be working on with a lot of my colleagues across the governor's office and at the state agencies. And I think I like this quote that the governor used towards the end of State of the State on Tuesday, but really reinforcing this message of a Colorado for all. So we've got a handful of items coming down, looking forward to this legislative session, one of which revolves around guardianship issues. And so the Office of Public Guardianship is actually an independent agency that's housed within our judicial branch. So it's not necessarily under the purview of the executive, but we do have appointing authority over their board. So we are engaged and involved with them. And I think guardianship issues, given our demographic shift, continue to be a growing issue in hospitals as well as in long-term care settings. So I talked a little bit about that complex behavioral health medical need intersection that very much overlaps with guardianship issues. I also have already mentioned a little bit around the skilled nursing rate reform. That's something that we are working towards this legislative session, and this will be probably really my number one priority as we move forward.
Jared, can I pipe in for just 1 second? I see that Senator Janal has a hand up, and I'm wondering if she may want to add something to the legislative items.
Yeah.
Senator Janal?
Oh, thank you. I was unable, I was at a conflicting appointment, so my apologies to everyone. And I just want to say, I would like to wait till Jarrett's done because he's doing such a wonderful job in his presentation, but I was trying to put it in the chat and I wasn't able to, that when he is finished, if I could just say a few words myself, and I apologize for the disruption that I've made. So please, Jarrett, finish your presentation, and it's excellent. And I know there'll be a lot of questions, but after that's done, if I could say a few words, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Jared.
Yeah, no, thanks, Senator. I'll move relatively quickly. I think I've got a couple other things to get through, but home modification tax credit extension, this is something that will be coming down as an agenda priority item. Got some adult protective services cleanup. That's relatively mundane, but I think that is already in the system. And then our legislative oversight and tax policy committee has also been looking at a tax credit for long-term care purchase with regards to long-term care insurance. So I think a lot focused on long-term care. I think obviously kind of tied to a lot of the impacts of the pandemic. So these are bills that are already in the system that I think kind of relate to kind of our either directly or indirectly to kind of supporting older Coloradans and their families. So just wanted to put this out there for folks to take a look at if you want to kind of spend some time poking around on the legislature's website. And then these are all bills actually from the 2022 session that were signed by the governor that directly support strategies that were laid out by the Strategic Action Planning Group on Aging that have been fundamental to my work over the last few years. I think none of which are more important, I think, ultimately than kind of House Bill 22-1035 that Senator Janal was one of our prime sponsors on. And I think I'll just go ahead and put a plug in for Senator Janal as well. I mean, we've been fortunate enough to work together really closely, I want to say since 2018, I think. So we've been kind of partners in crime on a lot of this over the years. And this bill really kind of rebased how we approach aging issues across state government. So it not only kind of reformed a little bit of our Colorado Commission on Aging, but it also gave some additional duties to our State Office on Aging, our Department of Human Services, codified Lifelong Colorado, and really just created kind of a context and formalized a lot of the work that I already do, but in 5, 10, 15 years, we need to make sure that someone is still doing that. This is just kind of an organizational layout of what kind of that reform means, but I don't want to belabor this too much. I know I'm moving up on my time. So I think I will end there. And I really just want to kind of thank you all again for the invitation. And I think, like I said, if anyone wants to reach out to Andrea afterwards and have a conversation about ways to engage, I'm happy to have that. And I think that this is an area that is only going to continue to become more and more important down at the General Assembly, as well as nationally, as our population continues to grow proportionally older. So I will stop there, and maybe I'll pass it over to you, Senator, and then maybe take any questions.
Thank you, and thanks, Jarrett. You do an excellent job, and I can't thank you enough. I think we've even worked prior to 2018 on various bills. I used to ask for your opinion on various areas, and They always served me well, and I'm so glad you're in the position that you're in, and able to help all of us legislators out in the governor's office, with the governor's office, in making very successful bills come to life. And we have done a lot of things. There's a lot more things to do. And I just want to make a few things. I just want to say a few things about what I try to do in committees. I'm vice chair of the Health and Human Services Committee, and I'm on various other committees. But every time something comes through, and we look at equity and equality and inclusiveness, I always will include and make sure that our seniors are also a part of that inclusivity. And that's something I just want you to make sure that I know that I'm doing, because it's so important that inclusiveness is part of our seniors and the age group of, 55, 60 and over. It's interesting. In the last week, I read several articles in regards to seniors and housing. Seniors who thought they were in a comfortable place for retirement, and with inflation, with all of these other factors coming into play, there are more and more people over the age of 60 and 65 that are becoming homeless. And this is of great concern to me. So the housing on the senior side, we need to address this as well. And there are many things going on at the Capitol right now that attempt to address affordable housing. And you can be sure that when it comes up in my committees or on the floor of the Senate, I will certainly speak out for the affordability for our seniors. So I am presenting the guardianship bill, because we have more and more seniors now who are finding they're outliving their friends, they're outliving their families, and they need someone to look after their rights and just their well-being. And this was a very successful pilot program in Denver, and now we're trying to expand the guardianship numbers, hopefully across the state, if not with as much as we can do as far as counties go and regions that we could cover. But guardianship for our seniors is a very important issue as well. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator. We really appreciate your leadership around aging issues in Colorado. Thank you to Jared. This has been really fabulous information. I'm very honored to have had a small role in helping to support this work, and we are just really looking forward to where Colorado goes with this next. I think this is an issue, given its cross-jurisdictional nature, that really crosses into so many league positions and maybe a broad interest to us. But I particularly appreciate the mention of the equity issues and the inclusivity issues. That's something that the League of Women Voters likes to pay a lot of attention to, and aging issues are certainly something that really deserves more attention. So we appreciate both of your time. We are rather short on time on our agenda today. We do have a very packed agenda. So we will be sure to follow up with any questions around the aging topic, both with Jared and Senator Janal, make sure that you can get answers to that. But I do want to switch at this time to Senator Chris Hansen. We have a conversation planned. He's going to be sharing some information with us really on the process of, how the legislature attempts to prioritize and, what really causes one bill to survive while others quickly die. Obviously there's a lot of reasons, a lot of factors that go into this, but one topic that I think is going to be of a lot of interest to our attendees today is quadratic voting. And so Senator Hansen has graciously agreed to join us for a discussion on that. And at this time, I would like to turn it over to him. Welcome, Senator Hansen.
All right, thanks so much for having me. And I'm just about ready to go into a candidate interview here. So I'm sitting in my parked car. Just want to assure everybody I'm parked. but just about ready to jump into that interview in about 10 minutes. So I appreciate you squeezing me in here before I need to jump to that engagement. But yeah, really happy to join you. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the process at the Capitol on which bills move forward, which bills get funding or don't get funding, always a very complicated one with lots and lots of different factors. Political, fiscal, the priorities from the governor, the priorities from the members, right? All combining to bring us together to a final package at the end of each year. And the Colorado budget process kind of starts every November. We get a proposal from the governor, and then the Joint Budget Committee, which I've served on for most of the last 4 years now, on Appropriations Committee in the Senate for this session. And we've got a massive number of competing priorities, as you can imagine, and limited funds to do it, particularly because of the impacts of Tabor over the years in Colorado. And so one of the things that I brought forward about 4 years ago and started in the House, and then now it's being used in 3 out of the 4 caucuses at the Capitol, is a chance to use what's called quadratic voting as kind of a preference poll at the beginning of the process as we start to look at which discretionary spending decisions we make. So this is a method that basically allows us to kind of take the temperature of like, where are the different caucus members and what areas do they want to prioritize in the budget for the discretionary spending, not the kind of main part of the budget, but just the limited number of decisions we need to make every year on expanding or changing some of the spending levels for like a new bill or a new proposal, a new program that comes in. And of course, we have lots of more proposals than we can fund in any given year. And that's going to be particularly the case this year, where we have very little as far as new spending opportunities in this year's budget. And so we've had this process that's developed over the years to, we've polled the members. We've had lots of one-on-one conversations as JBC and appropriations leaders. We take the chance to go back and forth, of course, with the House members and with the governor's staff. So lots of different processes happening. And one of the tools that we've used in the last 4 years is this QV, or quadratic voting tool. It essentially is set up to allow the members to say, hey, here are the bills that we care the most about as we start this process. And we want, and then we can compile those preferences and give us a good starting point as we start our discussions about which proposals are going to get funded that year. So it's a really helpful tool. It kind of, I kind of think of it as it helps us sort of build a heat map of where the biggest preferences are for across the different caucuses. And it sort of serves as that starting point for what becomes a very long and complicated discussion as we move toward the final decisions that we make in the Appropriations Committee that ultimately end up on the Senate floor. So that's kind of the process. The quadratic voting is really the same way as if I just gave every member said, hey, tell me your top 5 bills or the top 5 things. That's fine. The nice thing about quadratic voting method is that it allows for both the depth and the breadth to be captured mathematically. So it's not just linear voting, which is if I gave you 5 chits and just said, tell me which ones you like best. That's a okay method, but it doesn't provide all of the extra kind of detail that the QV method produces for us. So it's been kind of I think an improvement in being able to understand our members' preferences. But it doesn't replace or supplant all the rest of the process. It simply gives us a good starting point as we start our appropriations discussions. So I think there was one press article on it last year that I think really misunderstood how it's used. I tried hard to explain it to the reporter, but that unfortunately I think he kind of didn't understand how it fits into the overall process. But I wanted to make sure I had a chance to talk to League of Women Voters today, and I appreciate the invitation to kind of explain how we've used that at the Capitol over the last 4 years.
Thank you, Senator Hansen. It's a really fascinating process that you've explained. I do want to mention to our attendees that Senator Hansen has a hard stop at 10:50, but we're a few minutes ahead of that right now. So if there are a couple of questions, we may be able to have just a little bit of discussion around this. Please feel free to raise a hand or go off mute. You can also include questions in the chat. Okay, I see, Sally, you were up first on my screen. I will just need you to unmute.
Chris, I have a question. When you were talking
Yeah, hi,
about
Sally.
that type of voting, if I understood you correctly, I have 5 chips, but they have a number on them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I put the one most important, the next, the next, the next. And so when you talk about depth, you're saying, so 40% voted this one for number 3. But then, and things like that. Is that what you're saying?
Well, Sally, what you just described was the old method of doing it, where we would just give everybody, we just send out, a list of the bills and say, hey, indicate the ones that you think are most important as we start this process. That was the old way of doing it. The QV method, what's nice about it is you don't just get kind of an overview of which ones, get the chits put next to them. Instead, the QV method, the more you like a bill, the more of your kind of voice credits you spend on it. And so the reason it's called quadratic is that if you say, hey, I like this bill, that costs you 1 chit. If you really like the bill and you want to put 2 chits on it, that costs you 4, and then 9, and then 16, et cetera. And we give everybody basically 100 of these chits to kind of spend across all of the different bills that are being considered. And in that way, we sort of get depth and breadth information from the poll results. So there's a really great article that Wired Magazine did on this, which I'd be very happy to share with the group, that kind of explains it step by step. But this is, it's really just a way to kind of take a poll and not get stuck with kind of the linear method where you're just, you just give everybody 5 chits, because that's information, but it's way more useful to understand both depth and breadth of preference. And that's the nice part about the QV method.
That really, now I understand it. Sort of.
Thank you for that question, Sally, and that information, Senator Hansen. Let's see, next we have a hand up by Mary. And Mary, if you could take yourself off mute, go ahead.
Yes. Hi, I'm Mary Carher from Larimer County. And I remember the 9 News coverage about that form of preference voting, and their concern was that constituents didn't know how their senators or their representatives were ranking or prioritizing issues. And there was a sense that it needed to be public, that we all needed to know what priorities and preferences were being expressed by individual legislators. So I don't know if that's been addressed or if anyone else might have concerns about that.
Yeah, I mean, that was really, I think it's an important question. We did release the results. I think, again, I want to stress that it's sort of a kind of a heat map that we're creating at the beginning of the process. And so all of the votes that we take, all of the amendments that we make, or any changes, right, that's all in open meeting, public meetings. All of our votes are tallied and on the website, right? So I do want to differentiate between what we're describing here, which is a way to kind of get the sense of what are the relative priorities across, the members, versus the formal votes that we take. Because of course, all of those are recorded in public. So I kind of liken it to, me sharing a draft bill with somebody and trying to get their feedback. Hey, what do you think of this idea before it comes in front of a formal committee hearing, for example? So that's kind of, part of the legislative process. We're trying to get feedback from our colleagues all the time on lots of different bills. In this case, we're trying to get some feedback on, okay, which areas do you, the individual member, would like to see more emphasis this year in the appropriations process. And it's a good way to kind of get that feedback, create that sort of heat map of where the most interest is. And then we move into the much more formal process, which is, bringing bills to committee, voting on them in public, doing amendments in public, right? All of that is fully a public meeting. This is really more like just getting feedback on kind of the draft of what's on the table.
Thank you for that explanation. That is really helpful. We are down to just a couple more minutes left with Senator Hansen. Any final questions? We maybe have time for one more quick question. Okay. And I also see that Celeste has put the link to the Wired article
Oh,
that was mentioned. So
great.
please access that. It sounds like it'll provide some great additional information. Thank you, Senator Hansen. We really appreciate your time today and the
Yep.
information. Maude, I know it's time for me to turn it over to you. I'm not sure if you have a question on this topic or if you're just queuing up. So I'll let you speak for yourself.
Is Senator, excuse me, is Senator Hansen still on, or did he leave? I think he left.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
he's-
Okay, super. There was a thank you, Andrea. I am Maude Nerol, co-director of Action and Advocacy for the Colorado League and an economist and demographer. I spent much of my career in Nevada's state budget office. In other words, a budget and revenue nerd. If you're like me, or you just care about Colorado, you may wonder how our state's finances will handle both Proposition 121's cut in state income tax rates and Proposition 123's new and large fund for affordable housing. Here to talk about this intersection is Scott Wasserman of the Bell Policy Center. Scott, thank you as always.
Yeah, thanks so much, Maude. Glad to be here and join you all. This is a really big and intimidating room. Some great names that I'm seeing, and it looks like you've got a great day of information. So I'll try to keep my presentation relatively short and hopefully, have some discussion and answer any questions folks have. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I think what I'd like to talk to you about, and I think we will definitely be talking about Proposition 121 and 123, but what I think my hope for today is to give you a little bit of a snapshot of where things stand. Hold on a second, I just having a little bit of a technical difficulty. Give me one moment here. I want to shrink that. Everybody can see my screen. Great. So first of all, I think I have a few goals. One is I want to share with you just a general picture of what's going on with our state budget. And of course, 121 and 123 are going to impact that. I want to talk to you a little bit about what's going on with Tabor surpluses in general. We're also going to talk a little bit about education. And I think education is important not only because people care a lot about it, but it's one of the more complicated aspects of our budget. And it gives you a great flavor for how all of these different issues sort of collide and present us with policy choices. So first thing I want to do, I'm going to get right into it. I apologize for some unformatted slides. It's been a bumpy week for us. But the first thing I'll show you is, this is basically a picture over time. And most of these graphics, by the way, are taken from Legislative Council Economic Forecast or the Office of State Budget and Policies Forecasts. These are all documents that are available to you and online. I really encourage everybody. I mean, if there was one thing that I think every citizen of Colorado ought to do is access all the documents and information that are publicly available to you, because I think it demystifies a lot of the things that are debated. But here's just a general picture of, the general fund over time, the amount of money that's been coming in. And, what you can see is that Colorado really is experiencing for the first time very large Tabor surpluses. As you can see, for most of our history, we have not seen very large Tabor surpluses. Very early on, before this chart starts, in 1998, 1999, Colorado experienced some of the first Tabor surpluses after the Tabor Amendment had been passed. The legislature's decision during those years was to permanently reduce income taxes so as to avoid future rebates. And I will say that has had a huge impact. We used to have an income tax of around 5% or 5%, and that steadily has been reduced over time. But for Referendum C, I think the other thing that's great about this chart is that had we not passed Referendum C in 2005, you really can see the world of hurt that we would have been in. You can see this lower black line. That's the original Tabor limit base. And then, when we passed Referendum C in 2005, we reset the base, right? So that's that blue line. And you can see what a world of difference retaining revenue and eliminating what was called the ratchet effect, happy to talk about that later, has done. But now for the first time, we really are seeing very big Tabor surpluses. Now, as you can see, 21-22, we've already allocated those. I'll talk about how those Tabor surpluses were allocated. But what you're seeing in 22 and 23, and then 23 and 24, is right here in 22-23, by reducing our income tax through Proposition 121, we took about a $650 million bite out of the Tabor surplus, right? So Proposition 121 has already been turned on. And for 22-23, you know, that's okay. We still have about $2.5 billion over the cap. But then by the time you get to FY 23-24, which is the Tabor surplus that this year's legislature will be talking about, how to allocate, how to get that back to taxpayers, then you start to see how Proposition 123, which removed an additional $300 million out of revenue and allocated it toward housing, right? So now you have about an $800 million hit to the Tabor surplus. And so you are seeing over time, these Tabor surpluses starting to shrink. Whoa, didn't mean to do that. A little bit too sensitive there. No, now I've gone. Hold on a second here. Oh no, this is terrible. Okay, so what we are seeing, and I'm gonna explain a bunch of stuff in a second, is that our Tabor surplus is dwindling and diminishing. And a lot of that has to do with taking out about $800 million a year of total general fund revenue, whether it's a tax cut that's going back to taxpayers, or that's money that is going to a priority that was otherwise not being funded from the budget. Now, one thing I think is really important to understand, if you look at this graphic, it looks like from a nominal perspective, Colorado's, tax revenues have been going up and up and up. And what's the problem? Another way to look at this, and I think this is a great chart that was put out in June by Legislative Council, and what it shows you is that when you adjust for population and inflation, we actually look quite flat, right? And I realize there's a couple of ups and downs, generally speaking, but if you were to draw a trend line, what you would see is that general fund expenditures per person have pretty much stayed where they've been since we've recovered from the Great Recession. So from my perspective, it's like we recovered from the Great Recession, and that's about as good as it has gotten for us. We've seen some, increases in federal funding. We'll talk about that shortly. But generally speaking, if you're out there in the world and you hear from someone who says, well, every single year the general fund just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, yeah, that's true from a nominal numerical standpoint. But when you adjust for really important things like population inflation, you see that we've remained relatively stagnant in the amount of general fund that we are taking in and spending on priorities. Now, if you look at this year, I think what makes this year really interesting from our perspective, and the Bell has been around since 2000, we've been tracking these issues for a long time. I think this is really the first year where Colorado has bumped right up against the Tabor cap. What you're looking at here is a legislative council document, and what it's showing you is that, listen, you've got about $1.3 billion of room. Sounds really great. But then when you put in what they're calling scenario B assumptions, which is basically if we were just to keep up with inflation, keep up, deferred maintenance costs, do all the things that we need to do to keep our current level of spending and our current service footprint exactly where it is, and you meet our new reserve requirements, so on and so forth, you can see how we cross that dotted line. And so, the way I think of JVC members is they're like right up against that ceiling, right? And they have very little room to mess around with. And you might say to yourself, well, that's fine, that's that limit. But I want you to think about all of the policy priorities, and we'll talk a little bit at the end, that are floating around, all the new program ideas people have. If you want a new IT system at the Department of Revenue, that's going to cost you $40 million. If you want a new add-on, or you want to increase Medicaid reimbursement rates, or you want to get rid of the negative factor, which I'll talk about, right? That's where we are running out of room, and we really are up against the cap. And so this entire year, I think, is going to be about how do we afford ourselves just a little bit more breathing room. And I think the big paradigm shift this year is that it really will all be about the Tabor surplus. And one of the arguments that we made against Prop 121, the income tax cut, because, the proponents of the measure said, well, this isn't going to cost the state anything. This is just coming from the Tabor surplus. And the argument that we advanced was, if you look at the past 3 or 4 legislative sessions, every single year we are negotiating around the Tabor cap. We are either raising it a little bit, lowering it a little bit, paying for things from Tabor surplus that were previously paid for from general fund. I'll talk about that very quickly in a second. And so when we take money out of the Tabor surplus, whether it's for a good cause, like Proposition 123 for housing affordability, or if it's in our view, a regressive cause, like putting money back into wealthy taxpayers' pockets, 25% of every tax cut goes to the top 1% of earners, that money is now removed from that equation, giving legislators less room to play with. The other thing that's going on, all this, I promise all this will come back together. The other thing that's going on in Colorado, and I'm sure I don't need to tell you this, is that we are experiencing very high property tax revenue increases. And that's happening largely because of property values going up in the state of Colorado. And so this is, as I'll talk about, both a curse and a blessing. On the one hand, you now have people in residential homes who are seeing, and I'm seeing it too, increases because of valuation increases, as well as increases in local property taxes. You're now seeing, $200, $300 added to your property tax bill. So even if you're in a fixed rate mortgage, you're seeing that added to your monthly statement. Also, non-residential assessment rates are going up as well. Again, all because of property valuations. We can get into Gallagher, maybe in the question section, I can talk about why this is all happening now. But as we'll see, this is kind of like a curse and a blessing. Because this is looking at school funding. Now, when we talk about school funding, one of the goals of the state for a very long time has been, how do we get the local share? How do we get local property tax revenue to go up so that the state doesn't have to cover as much of school expenditures? Think back to this graphic. If we could just save, $57 million, right, then that would add a little bit more breathing room, or so on and so forth. And so on the one hand, higher property taxes are a real challenge for residents, right? On the other hand, it does give legislators a little bit more breathing room. The other thing is that we have something called the State Education Fund in the state of Colorado. 1/3 of 1% of all taxable income goes into the State Education Fund, and that's one of the features of Amendment 23. And over the years, we've been able to add a little bit of money into the fund. That fund is really meant to buoy education and can be used to balance the equation. What's going on this year, and this is from the governor's supplemental budget request, I think is really interesting. And the governor in his State of the State made a really big deal out of, I'm going to lower the budget stabilization factor, which is how much money we owe under Amendment 23 this year. But I want you to take a look at what's really going on here, right? We previously, right, had budgeted before the December forecast. We were thinking, we're going to have to put in about $150 million more dollars of general funds into school funding, and we were also going to need to take quite a bit of money out of the State Education Fund. If you see here, cash funds, what they're talking about is the State Education Fund. But two things have happened. One is that local revenues have gone up, right? And therefore the state share is lower. The other thing, and I'm sure all of you have been reading about, is reduced pupil counts, right? Is there are fewer kids going into the schools. So, this is a great example of how, and this is not necessarily a critique of the governor, But, you know, in this environment, it allows him to say, hey, look, we're putting more money into education, but in point of fact, we're actually reducing the amount that we're spending this year because we can, because local property tax revenue is going up, and we've got this reduced pupil count. So I think I wanted to share this with you because I think that there's going to be a big conversation over education this year. And I think that this gets, and what this brings me to is sort of like, I think we've reached this place in education particularly where for years and years, and for those of you not familiar with the negative factor or the budget stabilization factor, we have something in our Constitution called Amendment 23, passed in 2000, and it essentially said that we need to increase education funding by population and inflation every single year. And in 2009, we hit the Great Recession. The legislature didn't have enough money, and the courts ruled, and they said, you know, you actually don't have to fund, and it gets very complicated because of some wording in Amendment 23. And so we have been keeping track for the last, 12 years, the amount of money that we are short on the Amendment 23 obligation to schools. We owe about $10 billion if you were really to rack it all up. If you go to the School Finance Project, that's how much money we owe our schools to Amendment 23. And so the governor's goal is to try to zero out the budget stabilization factor, right? Not erase that $10 billion accumulated liability, but rather just not keep, for instance, last year, we fell short $321 million. This year, his goal is let's fall short $200 million. And there is a plan, right, to try to, how do we draw down money from the state education fund, right? How do we get to zero? But I think the question that us and a lot of other education groups are asking is, well, is that where the goalpost is exactly? Because according to the Colorado Fiscal Institute and the Bell, we think we need about another $1.5 billion a year just to get to the middle of the pack in higher education in K-12. And I pulled this from US News and World Report, and you can see where Colorado ranks, right? And so we are in the bottom 25th percentile for per pupil funding in the country. And I raise this to say, yes, we may well, within the next 2 to 3 years, be able to reduce our budget stabilization factor. But is that really going to be enough to get us to where we all think we need to be, which I would hope would be better than the US average? And I'm going to wrap it up real quick here. But one thing that I think is really important is back to 123 and 121 is that the only tool that we really have here, right, is our Tabor surplus, right? And so, a couple of things have been going on. First of all, a big question is how do you refund Tabor surplus dollars back to the citizens? And last year, we saw a really big change. If many of you will hopefully recall flat $750 or $1,500 checks. So for the first time, we didn't use an income tax rebate mechanism. We instead chose one solid number, right, that everyone would get the same amount. Very progressive in the way it put dollars back. We also, in an attempt, going back to this property tax problem, right, the governor has said he wants to lower property taxes for people in the state. Well, how does the state do that? The state controls the assessment rate. And we did, and Senator Hansen ran the bill that you just saw him seconds ago. He ran the bill last year to temporarily reduce assessment rates. Well, if you do that, all the local districts that depend on that revenue say, what did you just do to our revenue? And so the state has begun, again, a new conversation about, well, maybe we can use the Tabor surplus to backfill local districts. Think counties, school districts, special districts, right? And so you see this 399.7, right? That's taking money out of the 22-23 Tabor rebate, sending it back to taxpayers, but doing so to reimburse the counties and the local districts for the cuts to the revenue that they'll be seeing. This year, if we follow through with that temporary rate reduction, and there's going to be a much bigger conversation this year about lowering assessment rates, we're going to add about $300 million to what we are pulling from the 23-24 Tabor rebate. $170 million goes out to the senior homestead exemption. Now we're at 470. Tax credits, maybe some of you have read about the EV tax credits, things like that. That also comes out of our Tabor surplus, right? And so this is, I guess, hopefully where it's all clicking for you, right? Where, you know, in theory, 121 didn't cut anything, but what it did is it lowered the amount of Tabor surplus. And there's a conversation in the legislature about how should these dollars be used? Should we send them back to taxpayers? Should we use them to backfill local districts while we try to reduce assessment rates? And then many of you probably saw headlines that Representative Kathy Kipp and Senator Rachel Zenzinger have a bill to ask the voters if we could use the entire surplus to fund education. So there are a lot of ideas about how to use the Tabor surplus. And I think what we bemoan is the fact that we're taking these dollars off the table. And in the case of income tax cuts, and I talked about this earlier, I mean, it's simple math from our perspective. Every time we do an income tax cut, the top 1% of earners are going to get about 24% of the benefit. And so, you know, there's a very active conversation both on the should taxpayers get these dollars back, or should we use these Tabor surplus dollars to alleviate pressures that exist under the cap in the general fund? And I think education, whether you look at it from a property tax perspective or you look at it from a state funding perspective, is really at the center of the debate, not to mention all the other tax credit issues that are out there. So, you know, I'll just close on this slide, which is to say, and I'm often asked, like, how much is enough? We're trying to figure that out. But, you know, here, and this is a slide from the election, you know, we've got a lot of unresolved issues, right? I mentioned property tax backfill. If we want to keep assessment rates low, if we want to lower the non-residential assessment rate, that's going to cost somebody something. And is it really reasonable to believe that the state is going to use the Tabor surplus moving forward to backfill the counties, and what implication does that have? K-12 budget stabilization, I talked about that. Is that the real mile marker for us, or should we be doing more? Maybe we fixed our transportation problem. This is the year when we're going to turn on that 2-cent per gallon gas fee. You know, we ultimately never did fund. Over the years, we've just determined that we can't fund from the general fund transportation. So we're going to start to see supplemental fees. The legislature has approved that. They delayed it for a year. They got to turn that on. And then here, I just have a whole list of things that come up all the time. I'm sure you all talk about these things. It's great that we've got universal pre-K. It's 10 hours a week. How do we afford more? How can we do better? Higher education. Every single institution of higher education went before the JVC this year and said, if you don't raise state contribution, we're going to have to raise tuition, mental health, housing affordability, climate change. All these issues are in the mix. And so I guess what I'll just leave us on, and then I'd be happy to take any questions. I know I threw a lot of terms around, is just, this is the picture. So as you consider all of those issues and all of the things that people want funded, there's just very little breathing room. And all we really have to play with as a state is this Tabor surplus, which was very dramatically impacted by both the passage of 121 and 123. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop my share. And I know I threw a ton at you. I'd be happy to answer any questions or just to hear any conversation.
Scott, thank you much for that. As you said, ton of information. And we have a few minutes for questions. So if people would raise hands, or I will try to look for questions in the chat as well. Sally, you're up first and you are on mute.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott. Thank you for attempting. You didn't quite make it with me.
Okay.
Understanding the whole Tabor and all of that. And I've been here since we passed this stupid amendment.
Yeah.
And I'd like to have your slides so I can look at them more closely and think about them. But what I was asking was, so what do we do to teach new people in the legislature about all these complex things? Because based on some of the things I've seen in our national Congress, there are a lot of people who don't understand even basics. So how do we make certain that they actually understand and can ask questions without feeling stupid and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm really excited about this. We got a lot of new legislators. A lot of them have been advocates before they became legislators. A lot of them are familiar with these issues. I would say first and foremost, the Joint Budget Committee staff and the Legislative Council staff do an excellent job, probably much better than I did here, walking the legislature through their choices, through the legal issues of what they want to do. There's definitely some specialization that's needed here. Not every legislator works on fiscal issues. And so I do think you've got specialists. Julie McCluskey, who's now Speaker of the House, sat on the JBC for quite a while. She knows her way around the budget. She knows her way around Tabor. And I mean, I think it's not really possible in my view. And I think this is the biggest challenge we have, is that I would actually challenge us to go beyond the legislature, because this is about the citizens of the state of Colorado actually have the power here. And I think we published an op-ed in the Denver Post at the end of the year. We need to robustly educate Coloradans about how much money the state has, what the relationship between state funding and local funding is. And direct democracy requires much more of citizens and taxpayers. So, I mean, the legislature to me is half the battle. The bigger battle for us is how do we create, whether through graphics or videos or stories, things that help taxpayers make better decisions. I always risk being accused of calling the taxpayers or the voters dumb here. That's not at all what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that we are putting very complicated questions in front of voters. So the other thing we've focused on is how do we change title language? And this is something the League of Women Voters supported us on. House Bill 1321 2 years ago, and then Proposition GG this year. Just more information. For instance, if you want to reduce property taxes, voters need to know which districts this is going to impact and by how much, and that should be in the title. Another thing is, if you're going to vote on the income tax, well, you should see what you're going to save versus what someone else is going to save. And, $60 is a lot of money, but is it enough money to give up, say, better education? So how do we create a more transparent, more educational process? The Blue Book is great. I think we can do better. I also think that we have to talk about these issues now, like you all are, and not in September when we're up against $30 million of spending on alcohol ballot measures.
Scott, thank you. We have time for one more question. Peggy Leach, Boulder County, you are on mute.
Yeah, it's really more of a kind of a comment. And it's about having our Tabor refunds go to education. So I think that would be referred to the voters, similar to Proposition CC, which did not pass. And it seems like really headwinds here, considering that we just got $750 refunds. Just seems like really bad timing to try and send this to the voters.
Yeah, I'll just say, Peggy, you kind of hit the nail on the head. We just got some polling back. The Bell does polling throughout the year on this, and I agree with you. It kills me, but the debrucing frame, if you will, and debrucing, for those of you who are new, is just the phrase we use here in Colorado for allowing local governments or state government to keep money over the cap. The debrucing frame does not work with voters. And I think you're right. For better or worse, Coloradans are expecting those tax rebates. And so I think one of the debates we're going to have this year, I hope, is, are we going to use the Tabor surplus, or are we going to create a supplemental revenue stream? And I know that seems stupid because it's like, why leave all this money on the table and then create another revenue stream? But the voters have been conditioned over the last 30 years to see the money below the money above the line as a surplus. And I hate it. I hate the word surplus because it's not a surplus. So, we are in favor of looking at a graduated tax rate in this state. We are in favor of looking at a luxury home tax, open to other revenue streams, but also really weary about sin taxes. We have become very reliant on gambling, smoking, any number of sin taxes that people will vote for. So I think that's going to be my hope. Is the big discussion is, are we going for a de-Brucing, or are we going to ask a little bit more from the wealthier taxpayers in the state? Recognize that that's not everyone's cup of tea, but it is a policy question. So I think you're right. I think voters have been, over the years, conditioned to expect that Tabor rebate when we go over the line.
Scott, thank you. Excellent. As always, proud to call you an ally. We've been in the same room on bills, you and I.
Yep.
Now we are going to take a 15-minute break. We will return at 11:35 to look at preventing gun violence in Colorado. So 15-minute break, come back, more good information to come. Thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you.
Welcome back. I'm Beth Hendricks, the Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Colorado. And I thank you all for being here this afternoon. Let's jump right in with a look at Colorado's gun violence prevention legislation. LWVCO has both a gun violence prevention task force chaired by Rionda Osman, who was instrumental in putting together this panel. Thank you, Rionda. And a legislative action committee, the League's trained volunteer lobbying corps at the state capitol. The LAC votes on a stance on bills only after they've been introduced, and we read the introduced language. The LAC will be monitoring the introduction of all gun-related legislation this session. Speaking with us today are Representative Judy Amabile, representing House District 49, and Emily Engelhaupt, Senior Ambassador for Giffords Gun Owners for Safety. Rep. Amabile, will you please start us off?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for putting this together, and thanks everybody for being here. So I'm Judy Amabile. I represent House District 49. That's the western part of the city of Boulder, western Boulder County, Gilpin, Clear Creek, and Larimer counties, the western part of Larimer County. And so I live in Boulder. I have lived here for a long time and am concerned about gun violence on a lot of different levels. And 2 years ago, my first year in the legislature, we had the King Soopers shooting. And as a result of that, the legislature put together a package of 3 bills that spoke to that particular event. One was closing the Charleston loophole and adding to the things that can get you in a category of people who can't buy a gun. So violent misdemeanors were added with a 5-year preclusion from gun ownership. Last year, we ran the Vote Without Fear Act, and that stopped people from open carrying adjacent to polling places. This year, I think there was an appetite based on a lot of things, but to run more gun violence prevention legislation. So we formed a gun violence prevention caucus, and we've been meeting for months now just to talk about different legislation, talk about what's the most effective, what are the different, because there's so much stuff that we could and should be doing in this arena. And so we haven't quite finished our work. There are a lot of things being proposed. I would have to say that everything is on the table, everything you can think of in terms of gun violence prevention. So I think now it's really trying to arrive at what is the strategy for going forward. Should we run 10 or 15 bills in this space? Should we have a 2-year plan, a 3-year plan? And then, and then maybe run 5 bills or 3 bills this session and 3 or 5 bills next session. And we're looking at all of those things. I am not in charge of what the final decisions are in what gets run and what doesn't get run. But I have my name on a bill, and am particularly interested in looking at waiting periods, because I come to the work through the lens of mental illness. And I have a son who back in 2018 told me he was going to buy a gun so he could kill himself. And I didn't have any way to stop him from doing that. We went down to the local gun shop where he'd gotten a background check that didn't come back instantly. We cried and begged. The shop owner said, okay, we won't sell him the gun. And I think that saved his life, but it shouldn't be that hard. And so a waiting period has been shown to be very effective in stopping people from just having a bad day, basically, and going and getting a gun and ending their life. So I hope that will be one of the bills that makes it to the top of our sort of priority order. But I also will support the other measures that are coming forward. And, just so you know, the things we've been talking about, gun shop licensing, insurance requirements, raising the age to purchase a gun to 21, and assault weapons ban, some legal thing, there's something called PLACA, which is that there's some relief from liability for gun manufacturers, and this would look at that. So there are a lot of things being talked about. Somebody has a measure that would be about putting money into buybacks. And so those are some of the things, and I would love to take questions or just hear from you what it is you think are the most important things that we should be doing in this space. Thanks.
Thank you, Representative Amabile. Emily from Giffords, are you ready?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. And thank you, Representative Amabile, for your words and introduction as well to gun violence. I do have a slideshow here I can share. Sorry, okay. Oh, I need to share the screen. Are you able to see that okay? Okay, great.
Yes.
So my name is Emily Engelhaft, and I'm a member of Giffords Gun Owners for Safety, which was founded by former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, who unfortunately was shot back in 2011. And after a courageous fight for her life and grueling rehab, she formed Giffords organization. And within that organization is a group called Gun Owners for Safety that is all gun owners who value the Second Amendment and is a right that many Americans value. But however, we also feel that we should be free to go to school, to work, to places of worship without the fear of being shot. So we are a group that wants to shift the culture so that Americans are informed about what makes them safer and inspired to fight for safer communities, which is why we are committed to supporting sound and reasonable regulations that serve the safety of citizens across the country to help reduce gun violence. Just a little bit more about myself. I came into the gun violence prevention space back in 2019. I grew up in Wisconsin as a hunter, and safety was always the forefront of my mind when shooting. I'm also a nurse by trade, and I had the opportunity to go to a Nurse in Washington internship where I learned more ways that I could use my voice. And for me, the point in my life when I decided I couldn't stay silent any longer about gun violence was I was playing with my niece one day. We were just playing with Legos, and she stopped and she looked at me and she said, you know, Annie M, sometimes robbers come into schools. And, you know, for me, that just, it broke my heart. And I really couldn't handle the normalization or accept that normalization of gun violence in our country. So I joined this movement, which has been decades in the making. And I'm really grateful for all who've come before me and still fight for our safety every day. One of Gifford's top priorities is repealing the gun industry lawsuit immunity, which Representative Amabile spoke about. And so I'll go into kind of a general overview of that bill. And this is something that gun owners across the nation do support. And so it's a pretty straightforward bill. And there are three things that I'm going to, oops, sorry, the slides aren't advancing here. There we go. That I'll start, three things that I'll focus on is how the federal law shields the gun industry from most types of lawsuits, and then how Colorado's immunity law is one of the 3 states with the most extreme laws in the country. And then third, how this affects real people. There are survivors that have sued the gun industry here in Colorado that now unfortunately have faced financial ruin. So if we go back to 2005, George Bush was just reelected and Republicans had increased their majorities in the House and Senate. And Democrats have been scared to enact gun safety laws since the 1994 midterms. And the NRA was feared by both sides of the aisle. And so the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, also known as PLACA, was a top NRA priority and signed into law by President Bush. And PLACA protects gun sellers and manufacturers from most, but not all lawsuits. And it's just kind of interesting to look back at how many Democrats feared the gun lobby. In the Senate, 14 Dems and 1 independent voted for PLACA. And then even with PLACA, there are narrow exceptions that allow people to bring certain kinds of lawsuits. An example of one of these lawsuits focused on how the gun industry marketed their guns. You can see on the slide here that this is how Remington marketed their AR-15s by saying, consider your man card reissued. So a case in Connecticut really focused on how the firearm that was used by the Newtown shooter was marketed this way. And they focused that they said that the marketing targeted younger at-risk males through their advertising. And they also included product placement in violent video games. And so if we look at Colorado's immunity law, there is in 2000, a bill titled Concerning Limitations on Civil Actions Concerning Firearms was signed into law by Governor Owens. 2 Republicans, Senator Tech and Representative Clapp were the lead sponsors, and 4 Democrats voted for it. The law actually punishes victims by forcing them to pay the gun industry's legal fees if a case is dismissed. The other 2 states that have this law are Indiana and Arkansas. And so there is a particular family that I wanted to take a moment to highlight and how it affected these 2 survivors. So some of you may know Sandy and Lonnie Phillips. Their daughter Jessie was killed in the Aurora theater shooting. And in response, they had sued Lucky Gunner, who was the dealer that sold the stockpile of ammo to the shooter. And unfortunately, the case was dismissed and they were forced to pay $200,000 in legal fees. This resulted in them having to file for bankruptcy. They lost their home and they're still feeling the effects of this today. So we feel that it is time for Colorado to repeal this immunity and grant survivors the ability to sue without the fear of paying gun lobbies legal fees. And Giffords, this is a top priority for them and they won't stop pushing for this until it's repealed. So I want to thank you all for having me today. I'll also put in the chat our link for our gun owners group. If you are a gun owner or know other gun owners that are interested in fighting with us. And also on February 8th, there will be a town hall with former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords. So if you're interested in attending, that'll be at the First Baptist Church, which is near the Capitol from 6:30 to 8. So again, thank you. And I'll also put my email in the chat if anybody has other questions or would like to reach out.
Thanks to you both. We appreciate it. The first question that we have from LWV Mesa County is, we do have a waiting period for gun buying, correct? What is being recommended and how does this differ from the existing waiting period?
So no, we don't have a waiting period. Colorado has instant background checks. So if you go to a gun shop and you fill out the paperwork and I think they make a phone call, if your background check comes back instantly, then you can purchase the gun right then and there. We are, I think, in a moment in time when so many new gun owners, new people went out to buy a weapon that the instant background check system is a little bit behind. So people do find that their background check doesn't come back instantly. And so then there is sort of a de facto waiting period. But as things slow down, which I think they're starting to, then the instant background checks will start to come back instantly and people will be able to purchase.
Okay, next question is from Carol Howe from the LWV of Uncompahgre Valley. Is there some legislation that would require law enforcement to enforce laws such as Colorado's red flag law?
Yeah, so I know that is one of the things that's being contemplated for this session, is to take a look at the ERPO law that was passed in 2019 and make some changes to that, give it a little bit more teeth, and potentially, I don't know what's in the bill that's being proposed, but potentially have better enforcement, make it more clear when, right now it's kind of optional. And we could make it so that if certain things happened, that law enforcement or family members would be required actually to try to get a temporary order to take someone's guns. I do think that a lot of people after the Club Q shooting, and really after every mass shooting, look to the families and say, why didn't they do something? And I feel particularly sensitive about that because as the parent of a person who has schizoaffective disorder and gets dysregulated fairly regularly, it's hard. It would be very hard for the parents to know when that was needed. It's also very hard to get. The ERPO law says you can go down and petition the court. And I'm pretty savvy, but I have no idea what that means. I don't know how to petition the court. Do I just wander down to the courthouse and knock on a judge's door, or what does that look like exactly? So I think we need better education about how you go about getting implementing a petition. And do you need a lawyer? Does it cost money? People just don't know. So I think we could be doing a better job of that. And I think that's some of the stuff that might be in that bill.
Emily, please feel free to jump in if you have any responses to these questions as well.
Sure. I think to Representative Amable's point, I think there needs to be more education about how to use the red flag laws. I know Colorado Ceasefire has a pretty good handout on like the steps, but it isn't always clear exactly how the steps go. So I do think there needs to be more of a public education on how those work. Because they can help save lives. So yeah, I agree there. Absolutely.
Thank you. The next question comes from Shelley Roars of our Pikes Peak Region League. Shelley has a multi-part question, so I'm hoping that she'll unmute herself and ask herself.
Thanks, Beth. So I'm kind of in the middle of a bunch of things, so I apologize, and I was hoping to get my chat, but from a military family's point of view, right? My dad and 4 of his 5 children, including myself, joined the military. Rather than a ban on ARs, which usually gets a pretty adamant no from the NRA and anyone who is supportive of that group, what about a possible happy medium? I've heard, databases, people are against databases too. I don't want my name on some government. But in this particular instance, that's the only solution that I think is even a happy medium. You can have that, if that is usually used for law enforcement or military, but there will be a database of who has these weapons, and those that are red flagged are blocked from getting one of those legally, right? We can't stop those getting them illegally, right? We're not here to focus on that. So that's my first question. And then another question is, you've already mentioned ERPO, and somebody asked, what does ERPO stand for? And I am all for expanding and detailing what it is that you need to do to petition that court. That's extremely important to navigate. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I think for the AR bans, interestingly enough, I just 97% is another organization that did some research on different types of laws. That they grouped their research into who laws, what laws, and I think it was how laws. And they really focused, and they thought that the biggest impact that certain laws had were the who laws of who can own. So people who show a history of violence in their past shouldn't be allowed to own weapons or guns. As far as a ban, I think there's a lot already out there. There's a lot of AR-15s already on the streets. We, as a group, as Giffords, there are some gun owners that don't own ARs and some that do. So we haven't proposed a specific stance on that, but I do agree that there's definitely feelings on bans for that as well. So I don't know if Representative Amable wanted to speak further on that, or.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think there are tricky parts with a ban, and one of which is, what do we do about all the weapons that are already out there? And so part of this, I don't think we have the money, or I don't think it's in anybody's proposal to try to buy all those back or force people to give them up. So instead, you would have to be able to demonstrate that you had the gun before the ban went into effect, and then you would be able to keep it. But again, I don't know what might be proposed. And so I don't know what exactly the details are, but there are some parts of that the details are important and make it a little bit trickier and a little bit more contentious than some other things like a waiting period or a fix to ERPO. But bearing in mind that all of these things will have very stiff opposition. So that's just the reality of the world we're in. I think that if you go out there and you ask the general public, what do you think about all these different things? People are generally very supportive. The average person, I used to represent Jackson County, And there are a lot of gun owners up in Jackson County, and they're ranchers, and they use these weapons as part of their work. And, I asked them, how do you feel about a waiting period or about ERPO? And of course, they're completely okay with that, because they're not in a hurry to buy a gun when they go buy one. It's a calculated thing. We need another, this weapon is worn out, or I'm not really sure, I'm not a gun person. I'm sure you could tell that, but we've decided we need to make another purchase, and they do that in a sort of a calculated way. And they don't want people who shouldn't have these weapons to have them. But it is it's in the political sphere that there's so much resistance. It isn't about what the citizens want. It's really about sort of a culture war that we're in. And guns are on one side and gun violence prevention are on the other side, and we polarize around that. And it would be great if we could somehow break that down, but that's not a law that we can pass that would do that.
Okay, we have time for one more question. This is from Silverton House Whitehorse. What about individuals purchasing guns at gun shows out of state where regulations might differ?
Yeah, that is unfortunately a problem, because if some states don't require background checks, the guns are so easily transported across state lines. It would be nice if we had some federal legislation that could help reduce that, because it is very difficult between states. And a lot of times guns that are used in crimes do come from states that are that have less gun regulations and laws to protect from that. So that is definitely an issue. And I hope to see in the near future some more federal that'll help create that safety.
Rep. Amabile?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot to add to that. It is, if you ban possession, then you would also ban possession of things that come from another state. But of course, you don't know that somebody has them until you know that they have them. And if we're talking about background checks and license to sell and all of that stuff, it is negated by how easy it would be to just go to Wyoming or Nebraska or any of the border states and purchase there. And there's no way for anybody to stop you from doing that. So clearly the answer to all of this is better laws at a national level, but I don't expect that to happen anytime soon, especially in the world that we're in. So we have to do the best we can here, and maybe we can only slow things down. We can't stop things from happening, but if we save a life, 10 lives, probably worth it.
Great, thank you. If we haven't gotten to your question, we will forward it to the appropriate speakers and try to get an answer for you that way. Kathy.
Well, thank you so much to Representative Amabile and Emily, our great representative from Giffords. I'm Kathy Wilson, the other co-director of Action and Advocacy. Maud and I worked together with Andrea to advance the Colorado League's advocacy agenda. I spent my career in education teaching teachers how to be most effective, especially with students with language and reading disabilities. One graduate course that I taught was emerging reading and language. So naturally, I'm very interested in Colorado's new Department of Early Childhood that is rolling out and is maintaining our new universal preschool program. Here to tell us about that new department is Tom Massey, its chief administrative officer, and Susan Steele, the very recently retired president of the Buell Foundation, who was a member of the department's develop committee. Welcome, Tom and Susan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see you. I don't see Tom yet. Is he on?
He was, so. Let's see.
I'm here. If you can you hear me or see me?
Yes.
Or?
Yes.
Great.
We can hear you, Tom. Can't see you.
Okay.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I was delighted to be able to sit in and listen to a little bit of the last session, which was extremely interesting. I learned a lot in my 10 minutes. So thank you to both of you for that information. And thank you for the invitation to be here. It's very nice to see some familiar names and faces on the list of people listening today, people over the years that I've worked with or known. So it's nice to reconnect. Well, we're excited to talk about a very happy project that has come to fruition, and that is the Colorado Department of Early Childhood, which just became active July 1st of this year. But to talk about that, I want to roll us back a minute to a little history in Colorado. You know, we've all known forever that little kids are important, and we certainly know that their early development is critical. But in the mid-90s, for those of you that were around, was when the brain development literature and research came out, and it really highlighted the critical, from a learning point of view, from a brain development point of view, from a social emotional development point of view, the critical importance of the first 5 years of a child's life. Continuing on into their early elementary and on, it certainly doesn't stop there, but it begins earlier than many people thought. And so there had been a big new sort of aha moment about how important it is. And I'm sort of happy to say that Colorado had a governor at that time, Governor Roy Romer, that piqued his interest, and he included a council that had to do with early childhood, one of the very first ever in the country, actually. And we've had a series of champions at that highest level in the governor's seat over the years, each one sort of building on the one before it. No major changes, but growth along the lines of recognizing the needs and importance of early childhood, recognizing the needs to support the families of these kids, and also to support the professionals that provide services to them. These are all really important people, and they were beginning to get their due. We had major moves forward under Governor Ritter with the adoption of the Early Childhood Advisory Council, which is an important federally mandated council, but it helps to advise in this work. Tom and I have both served on that council, which in Colorado is called the Early Childhood Leadership Commission, for many years. So we've had the opportunity to do that. Moving on into Hickenlooper, we had the opportunity, I think it was about 8 or 10 years ago, to really make a major move forward by understanding that all the things that affected these young children, the people that were serving them and paying attention to them, were scattered all over our governmental agencies and departments. So we had some things for parents and public health. We had some things for kid and healthcare policy and finance. We had some things in the Department of Education. We had some things in the Department of Human Services, and even other departments like requirements for teachers for early childhood. So the first thing that happened under Governor Hickenlooper was pulling many of these services together under what was then called the Office of Early Childhood, which was part of the Department of Human Services here in Colorado. So it has been winding its way through that, and that was a major move forward, the opportunity to really help agencies collaborate with the best interest of the kids in mind, and the best interest of the families in mind, and the best interest of the providers in mind. So again, a big step forward. But our super champion was Governor Polis, who came into office and ran on many in many speeches and many conversations talking about the importance of early childhood. In the first year that he was in office, the legislature helped us to adopt full day kindergarten. And immediately he turned his eyes to the next step, which would be in the preschool realm. So trying to hasten this along, here we are, and we have the idea that preschool's important. And as we studied how we might do preschool here in Colorado, universal preschool for all 4-year-olds before they go to kindergarten, it became very clear that in order to do this, we needed a funding source, which is always a challenge. As you just heard on the last panel, money matters when you're trying to accomplish some of these things. And the voters of Colorado in November of 2020 approved by almost a 2-to-1 margin Proposition EE, which was the funding source for the opportunity to provide universal preschool. So now we had the beginnings of plannings, and we had funding, and we in earnest started to talk about how could that happen. One of the things that came out of the stakeholder engagement and talking to the people that do the work and asking them, what do you need? And talking to the families and saying, what do you need? Was to be able to elevate this work and to give it the credibility that it deserves. And so a department, an actual official cabinet level department of early childhood, it was determined that we need to do that. And then and their job would be to manage and organize and advise and offer all of the many services that affect these very young children and their families and their providers. So it came in legislation. And along with that, the universal preschool that had been the impetus for all of this. Tom and I, as co-chairs of the commission, spent a very long 9 months going around the state, talking to people, getting input, really trying to say, what would a high-class, really functional Department of Early Childhood look like, number one? And what would you need or want, or what would be best for kids if we had a universal preschool program? So by the end of December and early January of 2022, we had 2 plans. One for the Department of Early Childhood, one for the implementation for the universal preschool. So I think at this point, we are in the middle of implementing all of that. Planning continues for universal preschool, which will begin in fall of this year. And the department, as mentioned earlier, opened in July of this year as well. No, July of last year. Sorry, we're not to July yet. So Tom is now the Chief Administrative Officer at that new department. And earlier when we did this work together, he was with Healthcare Policy and Finance, but he's moved over to our new department. And I think it would be great for him to be able to tell you who they are, what they are, and where they're going. And I'll just say out loud, and they're doing it on a very fast pace, as you can imagine, trying to make all this happen all at once. So Tom?
Thank you, Susan. And yes, it is an interesting experience trying to lift a brand new department in the state with such a rapid pace. I'm the newly minted Chief Administrative Officer. I think I've been there going on almost 40 days now. And there was so much work that's gone on in the last 6 months to get to this point. But it really is a very rewarding experience. Like Susan alluded to, I had the opportunity to work with her for years on the Early Childhood Leadership Commission. And the interesting part of this is I've spent the last 10 years as the Deputy Executive Director at Healthcare Policy and Financing, but to come over to the Office of Early Childhood, where you're going from a social net program to something that is universally accepted. The fact that there's been so much great advocacy work done in the realm of early childhood now that it's risen to a level of great importance and great recognition, and it's completely nonpartisan. How do you argue with the fact that the success we've seen through the years with Head Start and early childhood programs like that, obviously now pre-K and full day kindergarten, pay incredible return on investment benefits to the children and families of Colorado? I mean, I've stated for years that really economic development in Colorado starts with early childhood. And I think that's really true as we watch, these children and families as they progress through the system. But it's an interesting ride right now because we are a new department and we're experiencing all the growing pains. Susan alluded to the fact that we're now tasked with lifting universal pre-K. Open enrollment actually started this past Tuesday, the 17th. And to date, we have had 12,000 applications submitted and eligible, another 2,000 in process. The only thing we will see is there will be some 3-year-olds that won't be eligible because they don't have all the factors that make them eligible. But we're up to 1,600 providers, which creates space for about 60,000 seats in the program. So I think we're actually well ahead of schedule on trying to get this program in motion. I have the privilege of working with an extremely gifted team that has been doing this work. I mean, it's not like everything is starting from scratch. I mean, we're actually moved a lot of this over from the Department of Human Services, what was, as Susan referred to earlier, the Office of Early Childhood. So many of these people moved over into the new department. So they're continuing a lot of the good work they've done for years. And we continue to pride ourselves on the fact that we do so much stakeholder outreach. As again, Susan talked about over the last 9 months, as we were putting these plans together, we did extensive stakeholder outreach, listening to families and providers and school districts and counties and everyone else that had a vested interest in this. And we're going to continue to do so. We want to make sure that we're nimble enough to make the appropriate changes we need to make as we lift these programs. We need to create the right metrics to know that everything we're doing is of the highest quality and meets all the professional standards that we want to deliver in Colorado. But again, it's a marvelous opportunity. I work with some of the greatest folks you've ever seen, and they're very passionate about what they do. And one of the things that my job entails is all the little details it takes to lift this new department. And so much of what we do is we've been very conservative in our ask for resources. We need to make sure we're adequately resourced. So that's going to be, as is anything else at the Capitol, it's going to be a continuing fight over making sure we have the resources we need, that we have the time that we need to implement programs, because we want to make sure when we lift, we do it right and we don't have to go through a trial and error period. So we want to make sure all of our technical systems are right. We want to make sure that the application process is as streamlined as possible for the families of Colorado. So it is an exciting time. We're looking forward to when the program actually lifts next fall. And again, it's going to be a great opportunity for the children and families of Colorado. So Susan, anything I've missed that you want?
Yeah, Tom, just to add, just for many people, especially if you don't have a little one in your immediate circle right now, they may not understand. Universal preschool at this point supplies up to 15 hours of totally free available preschool. It is for voluntary, just to be super clear. This is not a requirement. It's voluntary for children who are in the year before they enter kindergarten. So 15 hours will be covered. There are opportunities for additional dollars too for kids with some particular risk factors. It is very, very important that this be available all over the state. So a lot of work is going on to make sure that where there are kids, there are slots, and to make sure that that's available and that it's high quality. And I think that it is just one of many things that the department is going to be working on. This is the big, bright important, timely thing right now, but just to remember that at the same time, these other many things like early childhood mental health or home visiting for families, all of these other services that relate to these families and these kids are also in their purview and not forgotten, maybe on the back burner a bit for right now, but not forgotten. So I think we made it right up to the edge of our time here. I don't know if we had time for questions or not.
Please feel free to put questions in the chat or raise your hand. In the meantime, I'm going to ask a question. I'm so excited about this because I am very familiar with the research that backs this up and how important it is. What's your plan for getting the word out to families everywhere, including some of the rural areas? Are you advertising on television? You know, how are you getting it out? Are you depending on public school districts to get it out?
You know, actually, and Kathy, it's a good question. Well, that's one of the things that we have had extensive discussion on. You know, we don't want to, I hate to use the word marketing because marketing implies that we're going to devote significant resources to doing the outreach. So we need to be able to do this without actually having a budget for outreach, because we're better served spending that money on direct to families than advertising, so to speak. So, you know, we're actually meeting regularly with our comms team at the new department. We're working with all of our stakeholders, making sure the word is out. So much of it's word of mouth, but you're right. You know, where the challenge is like in some of our rural and frontier areas. And, you know, prior to being with HCPF, I spent 8 years in the legislature representing a rural district out of the Salida and surrounding counties. So I've always been very attuned to the fact that rural is different than metro or even suburban. So we need to make sure that there's equality across all of our districts, that we can provide the same level of service. Interestingly enough, you said you were specialized in reading and teaching. I had the opportunity in my years there to carry the original READ Act, which was the third grade reading act. Now it's gone through several iterations since then, but you know, I was very proud of that work, and that continues to be a focus. But yeah, we need to make sure that we're doing a job of getting the word out and making sure that everyone has access and knowledge of how to access the programs.
You know, Tom, I would also add part of the infrastructure for universal preschool was the creation of what they call local coordinating organizations in their regional groups. I think there are 34 of them, and they're regional groups whose job it is to work with their natural catchment area, to be able to work with families, to work with providers specifically to get the word out, also to be able to do some navigation with people that have trouble with, you know, internet or fear of computers and just getting information out. And so those folks have been very, very active, are very, very active in getting the information out. And many of them have been doing similar work for many years. So they have some substantial, they have connections already with their communities. And so that's another big thing. Also some help from some of our partners like Rocky Mount PBS doing some conversations. So
yeah, that's a really great point, Susan, because we are a local control state, and who better to deal with their own catchment area than these local coordinating organizations that you know how to reach their own constituency. So yeah, absolutely.
We're going to take one question and then we have to move on. Wanda, you were first in line for that.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a comment that the children who really need it the most are children of color and children in lower socioeconomic neighborhoods and with those experiences. And I would really hope that, I know that you want the money to stay in the program. I agree with that, but I wish you would reconsider doing a little advertising, because those children will be the ones who will not actually pick up on it. We need to advertise through the churches, You need to do school districts, social clubs, recreation centers. Those are places that you need to reach out to those kids, because those are going to be the parents who will not pick up on this. And so I'm just afraid that this wonderful program will be skipped by some of the kids who need it the most. So that's just my plug-in that I think you just have to meet and reach those kids who really need it the most. Thank you.
Yeah, Wanda, that's a great comment. We actually have a strong focus in making sure that we're reaching all the underserved populations, regardless whether it's ethnicity, race, geography, whatever the case may be. And I learned a long time ago that if you want to get to these particular groups, you really have to go to them. You have, just advertising doesn't reach them. You're right. We have to go to them to promote and to make sure that they're fully aware. So yeah, we do have a strong focus on reaching all of our underserved populations.
One final comment. I know you have to stop, and that simply is, this is only the first year. It's not one and done. So we're learning literally day by day how to do this. And we're really excited that we think that well in excess of 50% of the kids eligible are already basically in the system. So that's a big take-up rate that most people don't enjoy. So we're very excited about it. But Wanda, we will keep working on it to make sure that, and there will be registration all the way through till school starts. The first ones went in this week, but they will continue to do that. So hopefully we can match both of those. Thank you, Kathy. Appreciate it.
Right. Colorado is already known for its educated workforce. It'll be fascinating to see how much more advancement will happen with our public education beginning so early. Thank you, Tom and Susan. Your efforts are deeply appreciated. Now we'll turn to the Colorado League's priorities for this new legislative session. I'd like to invite my colleague, Andrea Wilkins, our Colorado Legislative Liaison, back to this virtual stage. Andrea.
Thanks, Kathy. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I've got just a couple of slides to sort of guide the remarks that I wanted to share with you. So just one second while I pull that up. And also, Kathy and Maude, please feel free to jump in as well. There's a lot going on in the early days of the session and a lot already going on with LAC. So we're just going to try and hit on some of the high points. But if you have questions or, if you're not already participating in the LAC and think that you might want to do that, please reach out to one of us and we can make that happen. All right, hopefully everyone can see my screen okay. So the legislative session has only recently got underway, as I think everybody is pretty well aware. The first day or the convening day was January 9th. And in typical fashion, there's been sort of the fire hose of legislation that has come down the pike. Since that time, over 150 bills have been introduced. And, we're just seeing things across the board in all areas. At my latest count and some estimates that we've kind of heard out in the community, it's looking like about a quarter of the bills have got bipartisan sponsorship. So that's something that we always try and take note of. Obviously, we like to see bipartisan cooperation and broad-based solutions to the policy issues that Colorado is facing. I wanted to give you just a little sense, a very small snapshot of some of the early bills that have been introduced, because that does kind of give you a sense of where the priorities are. Though at this point, we've seen so many come out that, we really are starting to see coverage in all areas or bills that address all areas. But some of the early bills that we saw in the House in particular focus on education supports, mental health supports. We've heard so much in the past couple of years about, mental health crisis amongst students. So we're seeing some resources being channeled into the schools to try and address that. This is obviously a longstanding concerning issue that we need to address, but clearly exacerbated by COVID. So there's a lot of work to be done there, and we're seeing some legislation that's attempting to start to really tackle this. Some of the early bills that we saw introduced in the Senate include a focus on housing, again, educational supports. That's definitely something that has been a big concern, again, sort of heightened by COVID and kind of the continuing fallout that we experienced there. And then another area where we saw some very early activity in the Senate was around wildfire mitigation. Not surprising given climate change and some of the really devastating effects that we've seen in Colorado and throughout the West. I think when you kind of look to these as an indicator of where the priorities are, I think it makes sense based off of what we all know and observe to be some of the priority concerns and issues that kind of rise to the top of the list within our state and in our communities, but also, really significant priorities for the league too. All of these early bills really kind of crossing into a variety of our organizational positions. In terms of leadership, we have Steve Fenberg returning as the Senate president. He is from Boulder, as I'm sure many of you are aware. We do have new leadership in the House with House Speaker Julie McCluskey taking on that new role this year, and she is from Dillon. One point that I'm sure many of you have heard by now, but I think it's worth repeating because it's really a cause for celebration that after the 2022 election, Colorado became the second state in which women are the majority in the state General Assembly. So I see some applause coming from Maud. Maud's got probably double reason to applaud because Nevada was the first. And Maud obviously has a history with Nevada as well. All right, moving along. I wanted to give, just a very high level overview of some of the priorities that we're hearing both from the governor and through legislative leadership. Given the fact that Colorado's government is in Democratic control right now, we're seeing a lot of alignment there. So things that we're hearing come from the governor through his State of the State address that took place earlier this week, or through the opening remarks that were made by Speaker McCluskey or Senate President Fenberg, during the opening day. We're just really seeing a lot of commonality amongst the issues that they're identifying there. Some of the key points, and I know Jared Hughes touched on this a little bit, so I won't get into any real depth here, but some of the key points that we saw coming out of the State of the State address that Governor Polis made earlier this past week, was really the focus on affordable housing and looking for strategies to promote greater density in development. We've also heard a lot of that density and smart growth strategy really get focused around the idea of simultaneously increasing options for transit and making sure that development is taking place within proximity to transit. So, this is something that we've been hearing about, I think really all through the interim and into last session, but we're now starting to kind of see some of the strategies come out as legislation gets introduced. Affordable housing is such a challenge for really every region of our state that we know this is going to be a really big focus of the bills that we see get introduced this session. On the topic of transit and sort of that co-location goal, trying to, kind of create denser communities. So we're reducing commute time. Clearly there's, a workforce consideration there, trying to co-locate people near employment opportunities and services. There's a quality of life issue there in certain communities where, just trying to get rid of commuting time and, provide people with the ability to more quickly get to where they need to be. There's a component there, but one of the really important things, it's a big priority for the league, is the co-location of housing and transit and smart growth strategies on the state's climate goals. The idea there being that, the more we can reduce commuting, if we can kind of reduce sprawl, that can help Colorado achieve some of those climate goals. So it's sort of a component strategy there, and obviously climate goals and environmental protection measures, all of that are things that have long been extremely important to the league and the Legislative Action Committee. We're seeing the governor really highlight investments in renewable energy and additional work that needs to be done in that regard. As is typically the case, there's always, a pretty big consideration about, funding for education, healthcare affordability. Both education and healthcare make up such a significant portion of the state budget that these are always really big policy issues that are complicated and, tend to be a strong focus within the legislature, and will also be a focus of the Legislative Action Committee as we continue to see more legislation there. One thing to note in regard to education funding, during the State of the State address, Polis had mentioned the goal of eliminating the budget stabilization factor, which we heard a little bit earlier, this discussion that Scott Wasserman had provided, trying to eliminate that budget stabilization factor in Polis's second term. So kind of looking out to the next 4 years, that being sort of a priority that he's identified there. We're also hearing a lot of talk about public safety. I think that it's probably, top of mind for a lot of communities that, we've started to see some concerning things in the public safety realm. Colorado, unfortunately, has really kind of gone to the top of the list in terms of auto thefts and things like that. So we're seeing some legislation to specifically address that, but really looking at the public safety picture more broadly. I'd mentioned wildfire mitigation. Clearly that is that is a problem that unfortunately is, not going to get easier to deal with. So we're seeing discussions there about how we mitigate that challenge and provide more protections there. And kind of in that same vein, protection of Colorado's water rights and investment in the state's water plan. So we're ensuring that we have the resources that we need to thrive, and that we're being smart about the management there. Just a little bit more on legislative leadership priorities. This really coming more from the perspective of the opening day comments, hearing McCluskey and Fenberg kind of outline their vision and some of the top of mind policies that will be getting addressed this session. I think in terms of, more the spirit of how legislators are hoping to approach the policy development process and, just how they ultimately work together. There was a lot of discussion about, ongoing efforts towards bipartisanship and, big things that need to be accomplished in the state really need to have all voices at the table. A priority, was mentioned on really entering into constructive collaboration, people coming together with a really strong problem-solving mentality. There was specific mention of legislating inclusively and the development of anti-racist policies. In terms of, more topical approach and, specific policy issues, Senator Fenberg in particular had mentioned protection for democracy, women's right to choose, and protection for the climate. So, some very big things that are rising to the top of the agenda and very high priorities for the league as well. Similar to some of the priorities outlined by Governor Polis with public safety, we're hearing that reflected amongst legislative leadership as well. Looking at public safety, looking at gun violence prevention strategies. Obviously, we've heard a bit about that today, and those conversations will certainly be continuing. But there's also been as part of, the public safety debate and kind of thinking through what those solutions might look like. There's been a real emphasis placed on addressing the root causes of crime, looking at addressing poverty, trying to be holistic in our approach. So I think that's something that we'll continue to hear more about as we start to see those policies fleshed out. Again, housing, that's just an issue that we will continue to hear about. Because there's just so much work to be done there. And then, of course, investments in education. There's a lot of concern about teacher burnout right now, teacher shortages. The pandemic did not, create an easy situation for educators by any stretch. So there's a real recognition that we need to figure out how to attract and retain really quality teachers. So our public schools are really coming at this from a place of strength. And then I want to conclude just by talking a little bit about some of the early efforts of the Legislative Action Committee, or the LAC as we refer to it. We have been busy. The session has just started, but where policy development is concerned, where the development of legislation is concerned, there's lots and lots of activity that really needs to take place during the interim, because that's when the stakeholder conversations are happening. That's when the debate is happening about, how a particular piece of legislation might get developed or how it's going to address a particular issue. So we've been really pleased to, be in a position where we've been able to participate in a variety of stakeholder conversations with important community groups and partner organizations that LWVCO has worked with in the past. We've been able to review various bill drafts and different policy proposals that are addressing things that are really important to us as an organization. They've really kind of run the gamut. There's been a broad range of things that we've been focused on in both the interim and then in the early days of the session. Things focusing on criminal justice, equal pay, prevention of age-related discrimination in employment, gun violence prevention, and of course, affordable housing. We have some ongoing efforts on some both emerging and longer-term priorities that we can continue to work on as sort of a long-range strategy. Definitely some action here over the interim, and we anticipate this continuing on as we continue to try and make progress. Key among that really is looking to find a good strategy to reestablish the right of almost 18-year-olds to vote in primary elections. We've had some discussions about this in various forums in the past. We've posted some articles on this. So I think that maybe many of you are familiar with this, but this is an issue that we've been concerned about with really since the passage of Amendment 76 with the 2020 election that had what we believe was an inadvertent effect or an unknowing effect by many, we believe, of disenfranchising almost 18-year-olds and their ability to vote in those primary elections. So we've had a series of conversations, and we continue to try and push forward with a legislative strategy that hopefully will re-enfranchise this group of young people. So work is continuing there. We are also getting involved in what I would call more of a new or emerging issue. We've had a few stakeholder discussions, some meetings within the News Access and Literacy Task Force around a review of model legislation and sort of the examination of other states' efforts, trying to learn from those endeavors in other areas that would require online platforms to proactively address the privacy and protection of children in the digital products or services that the companies offer. This is something that we expect to kind of continue on. So I believe that you'll continue to hear more about this as we continue our efforts and partnerships in this regard. And then, of course, the Legislative Action Committee, now that the session has officially started, has also officially started our biweekly meetings where we come together every other Friday. Our first meeting took place on January 13th. For those that are not familiar, the LAC is our Corps of Citizen Lobbyists. We focus on a very broad range of issues, running the gamut of the policy topics that are addressed by our organizational positions, ranging from government, obviously elections and voting is a component of that, climate and natural resources, and then a whole host of social policy issues. So we are really excited about the fact that this group is gearing up and looking very strong, as is always the case. The LAC is always comprised of some very impressive individuals, but it's certainly no different this year, but we are very excited that we've grown in numbers. So that also means that our impact can grow, the number of bills that we can take on and be really active in our advocacy, education, and lobbying efforts can grow as well. And we continue to see our regional diversity grow as well, which is great. You know, we've said many times, and we will continue to say that, you know, our ideal is to have LAC representation from every local league within the state. The more regional perspective, the more community level perspective we have that, you know, can really diversify and enrich the policy discussion and deliberations and the testimony that we bring to the legislature, all the better. That just helps make for good public policy. So we will be continuing those meetings and that work through the session. We would encourage you to check out our bill lists, which are just developing and emerging, but they will be posted on the Legislative Action Report page of the LWVCO website. We will be doing feature articles as we've done in the past. We will also be posting testimony and I believe our action alerts that we issue. So if you're interested in following the bills that LAC follows, kind of following our activity in a broader sense, that's a great go-to. And then be on the lookout for action alerts. It's not something that we issue, you know, every week by any means, but, you know, when there's something that we really feel strongly about and we think that, you know, there's an effort underway or a bill that really could benefit from mobilizing our statewide network around, we will issue an action alert around that. So we very much encourage you to watch out for those and to, you know, basically kind of follow the instruction that we're providing there. It's usually reaching out to either your legislator or members of a particular committee that's hearing the bill that's in question. But we're really pleased with how responsive you all are to those. And that makes a difference. You will hear legislators discuss in committee hearings about how many phone calls they get, how many emails they get, how many people are testifying or having conversations with them about something. So our voice matters, and you know, our collective impact is, and our statewide network is, you know, really our strength. So look out for those, participate, and please don't hesitate to get in touch with me, Kathy, or Maud, Beth, or Hannah. There's a whole host of us that can bring you into the LAC if that's something you're interested in, or if you just have questions and need information about what we're doing or questions about activity down at the General Assembly, just let us know. And I'll go ahead and stop there and see if Kathy or Maud would like to add anything.
I think you did a good job of covering it, Andrea.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes, we're busy and we invite people to join us in this very interesting work that we do.
And also, as Irene will mention, to join our task forces. We have 9 in a wide variety of topics. So thank you, Andrea.
Well, thank you all. And I have to pat us on the back. We really stuck to our agenda. We've got good timing today.
Andrea, if you'll stop sharing.
Oh, sorry about that.
That's okay.
Let me get that.
Well, there you all are. Hello. Hey, wow. I'm kind of exhausted listening to her. right? And this is just the tip of the iceberg on the league's work. It's amazing what the League of Women Voters has evolved in with the state of Colorado. And, you know, we just couldn't do it without your leadership, Andrea. We're so thankful you're on our staff, and we just, you know, you lead us all the time in the right direction, and we're happy for that. Well, this wraps it up for the 2023 Legislative Conference. I hope you all leave with the feeling of being inspired by what you've learned and relieved that so many awesome people are working hard to keep our democracy healthy and intact. And I hope you'll join us. The Colorado League, as Maud said, has, she said 9 action-oriented task forces. Well, we actually have 10. Or one that's creating. It's okay. They're all evolving and creating, and it really doesn't matter. 9 or 10 task forces that are statewide. It's great. They're working on everything from elections to gun violence prevention to reproductive justice. And all are welcome. Membership is not required to be on the task force. So please, we ask you, spread the word. Do you know somebody, you have a conversation at work, and you know somebody that says, hey, you know, I heard this bill, what's going on about gun violence? You give them the information, you give them our website, you say, you know what, maybe you ought to just join up and see what's going on over at the League of Women Voters. I think that's the way we get the word out on the task forces. Always just check our website calendar, sign up. Next thing you'll know, you'll be working with others on how to take action on an issue. And they may lead to testifying before the State House Committee. Wouldn't that be cool, right? And who knows, you might even run for office. We're banking on you. If you found this conference to be worthwhile, please consider making a donation to the Colorado League. We're putting an easy link in the chat box now. But whether you donate or not, we're glad you joined us today and appreciate your motivation to learn more about this year's legislative priorities and empowering voters and defending democracy. That's it, right? Empowering voters, defending democracy. That's what we're about. I also want to say thank you to Yadira Solis at El Seminario for their awesome membership and for helping us work towards our equity goals. Thanks to the incredible LWVCO staff that helped coordinate this conference. That's Beth Hendricks, Andrea Wilkins, and Hannah Pogue. The 3 of you, we don't know what we would do without you, and we wouldn't be on this Zoom today without you, so thank you. But before I let you go, I want to invite those of you in the Denver metro area to join us this Wednesday at a special fundraiser featuring Major Garrett, NBC's chief Washington correspondent, and David Becker, the executive director of Nonpartisan Center for Election Innovation and Research. Together, the 2 of them have written a book titled The Big Truth: Upholding Democracy in the Time of the Big Lie. Both Major and David will join LWVCO at a private reception at the I think it's pronounced that SIE Film Center next door to Tattered Bookstore, before their book talk at Tattered Covered Bookstore. I'm going to get that right. Okay, so basically we're having a reception next door to Tattered Cover for when they do a book signing. Sounds pretty exciting to me. It sounds like a great way for all of us to get together. This is a fundraiser though, and it's so for the LWVCO to allow us to offer other events like these. So also with live interpretation. So I hope you join us. Go to the LWVCO website to register. Thanks to everyone for your time and engagement, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thank you. Goodbye.